The storm came like judgment, and with it, a giant of a man cradling a baby against his chest, asking if they could stay the night. Violet Johnson hadn't let a man's skin touch hers in 16 years. Not since Marcus. Not since the betrayal that carved her hollow and left her with nothing but this saloon and the name they whispered behind her back. Black Widow. She stood in the doorway of her establishment, watching the stranger through sheets of rain that turned Coyote Cliff's Main Street into a river of mud. Lightning split the sky, illuminating his massive frame. Water streamed from his beard, from the brim of his hat, from the bundle he held so carefully against his chest. The baby's cry cut through the thunder. Violet's hand found the door frame. Her knuckles went white. The wood was solid beneath her palm, real as the ache that lived in her chest, real as the memory of Marcus's hands on her throat the night she discovered what kind of man she'd married. The stranger took a step closer. His boots squelched in the mud. Water pooled around his feet. "Ma'am," his voice carried despite the storm, deep, careful, "please." The baby cried again, smaller now, weaker. Violet had built her life on distance, on the space between herself and harm, on the careful choreography of never touching, never trusting, never letting anyone close enough to destroy what little remained of her heart. But the child was dying in the cold. Her hand moved to the latch, hesitated. 16 years of careful walls, of protective silence, of sleeping alone and waking alone and walking through her days like a ghost haunting her own life. The stranger shifted the bundle. His movements were gentle despite his size, protective, the way a father might hold his own blood. "I got coin," he said. "Just need somewhere dry, somewhere safe." Safe. The word hung between them like smoke. Violet knew safe. Safe was locks and loaded guns and a bed pushed against the wall so nothing could come at her from behind. Safe was never letting anyone close enough to hurt her again. But safe was also what this child needed, what the stranger was asking for. Thunder shook the building. The baby's cries grew desperate. Violet's fingers found the latch. Cold metal against skin that hadn't known a man's touch since the night Marcus tried to kill her for learning his secrets. Since the night he disappeared and left her with blood under her fingernails and questions no one dared ask. She opened the door. The stranger stepped inside, bringing the smell of rain and pine and something else. Something that reminded her of the mountains where honest men still lived. His presence filled her saloon, made the space feel smaller and somehow safer at the same time. "Thank you." He pulled back the blanket, revealing a tiny face red from crying. Maybe 6 months old, maybe less. "She's been fighting the fever for 2 days, a daughter." Violet closed the door behind them, turned the lock. The simple action felt monumental, like crossing a bridge she'd burned 16 years ago. "There's a room upstairs," she heard herself say. "Clean beds, dry clothes if you need them." The stranger nodded. Water dripped from his coat onto her floor. "Magnus McAllister, this here's Hope." Hope. The name settled in Violet's chest like a weight. "Violet Johnson," she gestured toward the stairs. "Most folks just call me Vi." That was a lie. Most folks called her Black Widow, and they said it like a curse. Like a warning to stay away from the woman who'd buried one husband and never looked for another. Magnus followed her up the narrow staircase. His boots were quiet on the wood despite his size. Careful. Like a man who understood the value of not making unnecessary noise. The room she led him to was her best. Clean sheets, a window that faced away from the street, a chair by the hearth where she sometimes sat on nights when sleep wouldn't come. "I'll get you some hot water," she said. "Milk for the baby if you need it." "That's kind of you, kind." Another word that felt foreign in her mouth. Violet Johnson wasn't kind. She was careful, guarded. A woman who'd learned that kindness was a luxury that could get you killed. But looking at the child in Magnus's arms, at the way he held her like she was made of spun glass, Violet felt something crack inside her chest. Something that had been frozen for so long she'd forgotten it was there. She went downstairs to heat water. The storm raged outside, rattling the windows, making the walls creak and groan. But inside, for the first time in 16 years, Violet Johnson wasn't alone. The kettle whistled. Steam rose from the spout like prayers or wishes or the ghosts of all the things she'd lost when Marcus showed her what men were capable of. But Magnus wasn't Marcus. She could see it in the way he'd held the child, in the pleas that had cut through the storm, in the careful distance he'd maintained even as she'd let him into her sanctuary. Violet poured the hot water into a basin, added cool water until the temperature was right, checked it twice because precision mattered when a child's life hung in the balance. When she returned to the room, Magnus had removed his coat. His shirt was damp but clean. He'd positioned himself in the chair, the baby cradled against his chest, and was humming something low and wordless. A lullaby. The sound wrapped around Violet's heart and squeezed. Violet set the basin on the small table beside Magnus's chair. Steam rose between them, carrying the scent of soap and something else, something that felt dangerous in its simplicity. Trust. She stepped back, put the width of the room between herself and the man who'd brought winter into her carefully ordered world. Her hands found the worn fabric of her skirt, smoothing wrinkles that weren't there. Magnus dipped a cloth into the warm water. His movements were precise, gentle, the kind of careful that came from practice, not instinct. He bathed the baby's face, her tiny hands, speaking in whispers too low for Violet to catch. The child quieted under his touch. Violet watched from her corner, back pressed against the wall where shadows gathered thick. The storm outside had gentled to steady rain, drumming against the window glass in rhythms that reminded her of other nights, other storms, other men. Marcus had come to her during a storm. 16 years ago when Coyote Cliff was nothing but mud and hope, and the kind of dreams that died hard in desert ground. He'd been handsome then, charming, full of promises about the life they'd build together. She'd believed him, touched him, led him into her bed and her heart and her foolish, trusting soul. The memory tasted of ash. Magnus finished cleaning the baby and wrapped her in the dry blanket Violet had provided. His hands were scarred, she noticed. Old wounds healed white against sun-darkened skin. Working hands, honest hands. But Marcus's hands had looked honest too. She's beautiful, Violet said, because the silence was growing too heavy, too full of things she couldn't name. Gets that from her mama. Magnus settled back in the chair, the child tucked against his chest. Sarah was the prettiest thing you ever saw. Hair like spun gold, eyes blue as mountain lakes. Sarah, a white woman's name. Violet felt something twist in her stomach, something that might have been relief or disappointment or the bitter recognition that some things never changed. Even here, even in this room where kindness had taken root, the world remained divided into those who belonged and those who didn't. Where's Sarah now? The question slipped out before Violet could stop it. Magnus's jaw tightened. His eyes found the window, the rain-dark glass that reflected nothing but their own broken selves. Gone. The word fell like stone into still water. Final, complete. Violet knew gone. Knew the weight of it, the way it settled in your chest and made breathing an act of will. She'd learned gone the night Marcus disappeared, leaving nothing behind but blood on the floorboards and questions that would follow her forever. I'm sorry, Magnus nodded, said nothing. The baby stirred in his arms, made small sounds that weren't quite crying. He adjusted his hold, began that wordless humming again. Violet found herself moving closer. Not close enough to touch, never that, but close enough to see the child's face in the lamplight. Tiny features, perfect and unmarked by the world's cruelties. A small fist curled against Magnus's shirt. How old? 6 months, maybe 7. Hard to tell. Maybe. The word hung between them, heavy with implications. Most fathers knew their children's ages to the day, the hour. Most fathers didn't speak in maybes. But Violet didn't press. She understood secrets, the way they burrowed deep and made homes in the spaces between truth and survival. The baby's eyes opened. Dark eyes, not blue like mountain lakes. Dark like rich earth, like the coffee Violet ground each morning, like her own face reflected in still water. Understanding hit her with the force of a physical blow. This child wasn't just Magnus's daughter. She was Sarah's too, but she was also something else. Someone else. mixed blood in a world that had no patience for in-between. No wonder Magnus had come here to her saloon, to the woman they called Black Widow. No wonder he'd stood in the storm asking for sanctuary. Who else would take them in? Violet's throat closed. Her hands found the wall behind her, pressed flat against wood that suddenly felt too thin, too fragile to hold back the weight of what she understood. This man hadn't just brought her a child to shelter. He'd brought her a mirror, a reflection of all the ways the world carved people into pieces and called it natural. "The locket," she said. Her voice came out steady despite the earthquake in her chest. "That's expensive work." Magnus's hand moved to the small gold chain around the baby's neck. His fingers traced the delicate metalwork, the kind of craftsmanship that cost more than most folks in Coyote Cliff made in a year. It was her mother's. Another truth that wasn't quite the whole truth. Violet could hear the careful distance in his words, the way he spoke around the edges of something larger, but she didn't push. Secrets were earned, not taken. Outside, the storm was dying. The rain had gentled to whispers against the glass, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the first tentative sounds of the town waking up. Doors opening, voices calling, the everyday noise of people who'd survived another night. Soon they'd know about Magnus, about the baby, about the strange man who'd appeared in the storm and found shelter in the Black Widow's lair. Soon the questions would start. Violet straightened, smoothing her skirt again. Business, that's what this was, a transaction. Room and board in exchange for coin, nothing more. But when she looked at Magnus, at the way he held the child against his heart, she felt the lie crumble before it could take root. This wasn't business. This was something else entirely. Something that made her chest tight and her hands shake and her carefully constructed walls feel thin as paper. Something dangerous. Dawn came gray and unwelcome, carrying voices from the street below. Violet woke to the sound of her name being spoken in hushed tones, the way people talked about weather that might turn deadly. She dressed in darkness. Her hands found familiar routines. Buttons, laces, the small rituals that armored her against each new day. Through the thin walls she could hear Magnus moving in the guest room, the baby's soft cries, his deeper voice, gentle and reassuring. The voices outside grew louder. Violet descended the stairs, each step creaking its warning. Sunlight filtered through her windows, pale and uncertain. She unlocked the front door, stepped onto the porch that served as her threshold between safety and the world. Mrs. Henley stood in the street with two other women, their heads bent together in the ancient dance of gossip. They looked up when Violet appeared, faces sharp with curiosity. "Morning, Vi." Mrs. Henley's smile was thin as paper. "Heard you had visitors last night." Violet said nothing. Let the silence stretch until it grew uncomfortable. "Storm brought all kinds of trouble," another woman added. "Martha saw a man go into your place, big fellow. Strange looking, strange." The word carried weight in a town where different meant dangerous. "Man's got a right to shelter," Violet said. Her voice cut through the morning air, final as a door closing. The women exchanged glances. Mrs. Henley stepped closer, lowering her voice to the register reserved for secrets and sins. "That's not all he's got from what Martha says. Heard crying, baby crying." The words hung in the air between them. In Coyote Cliff, babies meant questions. Questions meant attention. Attention meant trouble for people who lived on the margins of acceptable. Violet's hands found the porch railing, gripped hard enough to feel splinters bite her palms. Lots of things cry in storms. But the women weren't listening anymore. Their attention had shifted to something behind her, and Violet turned to see Magnus filling her doorway. The baby was quiet in his arms, wrapped in the blanket she'd given him. In daylight, his size was even more imposing. He stood well over 6 feet, shoulders broad enough to block the morning sun. The women stepped back instinctively. "Ladies." Magnus touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of politeness that somehow made him seem more dangerous, not less. Mrs. Henley found her voice first. "Don't believe we've been introduced." Magnus McAllister. He didn't step down from the porch, didn't close the distance between himself and their judgment. "Passing through, With a baby. The words slipped out before Mrs. Henley could stop them. Magnus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. With my daughter. The admission settled over the group with the weight of thrown stones. Violet felt the shift in the air, the way truth changed everything and nothing at once. Where's the mother? The question came from the youngest woman, barely out of girlhood herself. Magnus's eyes found the distant mountains, purple against the morning sky. Gone, gone. The same word he'd used the night before, carrying the same finality. But in daylight, surrounded by suspicious faces, it sounded different. Harder. More like a wall than a wound. Gone where? Mrs. Henley pressed. This time Magnus didn't answer, just shifted the baby in his arms and stepped back into the saloon's shadows. The women watched him disappear, then turned their attention to Violet. She could see the calculations in their eyes, the way they weighed risk against curiosity. Vi, Mrs. Henley said carefully, you sure you know what you're doing? The question hit deeper than intended. Violet had spent 16 years asking herself the same thing, measuring every choice against the memory of the last time she'd trusted wrong. I know enough. But did she? Standing on her porch in the growing light, feeling the weight of the town's attention, Violet wondered if she'd already made a mistake that would cost more than she could afford. The women drifted away eventually, carrying their questions and suspicions back to their own lives. But Violet remained on the porch, watching the street, thinking about the locket around the baby's neck. She'd recognized the workmanship because she'd seen it before. 6 months ago, when news of the Pemberton massacre had reached Coyote Cliff. The territorial newspaper had run sketches of the family, detailed descriptions of their belongings. The locket had been mentioned specifically, along with estimates of its value. The Pembertons had been abolitionists. Rich ones, with connections back east and money enough to fund safe passage for people fleeing bondage. They'd been traveling with a small wagon train when the attack came. Raiders had killed everyone, burned the wagons, scattered the bodies across 20 miles of desert. No survivors, the paper had said. No trace of the Pemberton baby. But here was the locket, hanging around a child's neck in Magnus McAllister's arms. Violet pressed her palms against the railing until the wood bit deep. Questions multiplied in her mind, each one sharper than the last. How had Magnus come by the child? What had happened to the Pembertons? Why had he come here to her, carrying secrets that could get them all killed? Behind her, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Magnus's boots, careful and quiet. He emerged from the saloon carrying a cup of coffee, steam rising from the surface in lazy spirals. They'll be back, he said, not a question. With the sheriff, most likely. Violet turned to face him. Sheriff Dalton doesn't care much for mysteries. Magnus nodded, unsurprised. His free hand rested on the baby's back, protective and sure. How long do we have? We. The word slipped out before Violet could catch it, binding her to his trouble whether she wanted it or not. Day, maybe 2, depends on how curious folks get. Magnus sipped his coffee, eyes scanning the street. He moved with the awareness of a man accustomed to watching horizons, to reading danger in the distance. I can leave, he said. Take her somewhere else. Don't want to bring trouble on you. The offer was generous, practical. The smart thing would be to accept it, send him on his way before Sheriff Dalton arrived with his questions and his badge and his particular brand of frontier justice. But Violet found herself shaking her head. Where would you go? Next town's 50 miles, and they're not as understanding as Coyote Cliff. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Coyote Cliff wasn't understanding at all. It was suspicious and small-minded and quick to judge anything that didn't fit its narrow vision of normal. But it was also home, her home. And for reasons she couldn't name, the thought of Magnus and the baby facing the desert alone made something twist in her chest. Besides, she added, baby's too young for hard travel. Needs steady care. Magnus studied her face, searching for something she wasn't sure she wanted him to find. Why are you helping us? The question she'd been asking herself since the moment she'd opened her door. Violet looked down at the child in his arms, at the small face peaceful in sleep, at the gold locket catching morning light. Maybe I'm tired of being careful." The admission surprised them both. The attack came at midday, when the sun burned white and merciless above Coyote Cliff. Violet was washing glasses behind the bar when the first shots cracked through the desert air. 3 riders on the ridge above town, close enough to count but far enough to blur into heat shimmer. Scouts. Magnus was beside her before the echoes died, moving faster than any man his size should. The baby remained upstairs, sleeping in the borrowed cradle Violet had fashioned from a dresser drawer and old quilts. "Stay low." His voice carried the authority of experience. Away from the windows. Violet ducked behind the bar, glass still in her hands. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her breathing stayed steady. Fear was an old companion, familiar as her own shadow. More shots, closer now. The riders had moved down from the ridge, were testing the town's defenses, finding its weak places. "They're not raiders," Magnus said. He'd positioned himself by the front window, peering through a gap in the curtains. "Too few. Too sloppy." "Then what?" "Message." His jaw tightened. "Letting us know they're watching. Us." The word bound them together in shared danger, made allies of strangers. Violet set down the glass. Her hands found the shotgun she kept beneath the bar, fingers checking the familiar weight of loaded barrels. The metal was cool against her palms, solid and reassuring. "How many?" "3 I can see. Maybe more hanging back." The baby's cry drifted down from upstairs, thin and frightened. Magnus tensed, every instinct pulling him toward the child. "Go," Violet said. "I'll watch the street." He hesitated. In the space of that pause, she saw him measuring her, weighing her capacity against the threat outside. "I can handle a gun," she added. Magnus nodded once, then disappeared up the stairs. His boots were silent on the wood, ghost quiet despite his size. Violet moved to the window, took his place at the glass. The riders had stopped in the middle of Main Street, horses dancing beneath them. Young men, she saw now, barely old enough to grow proper beards. Cowboys, maybe, or drifters looking for easy money. But they wore their guns with the casual confidence of men who'd used them before. The leader was thin as wire, hat pulled low against the sun. He called out something she couldn't catch, words that dissolved in heat and distance. One of his companions laughed, the sound sharp and unpleasant. Then they were moving again, spurring their horses toward the saloon. Violet stepped back from the window. The shotgun felt heavier now, weighted with possibility. She'd killed before, though the law had never called it that. Self-defense, they'd ruled. Justified response to a husband's violence. But that had been close work. Intimate and desperate and over in seconds. This was different. This was war. The riders stopped outside her door. She could hear their horses snorting, leather creaking, the low murmur of voices planning mischief. Magnus returned, moving silent as smoke. The baby was quiet now, either soothed or too frightened to cry. "They're testing us," he said, "seeing how we react." "React to what?" Before he could answer, someone pounded on the door. 3 hard knocks that shook the frame. "We know you're in there, mountain man." The voice was young, cocky. "Come on out, bring the baby." Magnus went very still. Violet watched his face, saw something cold and final settle in his eyes. "You know them?" "No, but they know me." The pounding came again, more insistent. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We just want to talk." Talk. In Violet's experience, men with guns rarely wanted conversation. "What do they want with the baby?" Magnus's hand moved to the pistol at his hip. "Same thing everyone wants. Answers." But that wasn't the whole truth, and Violet could hear the careful editing in his words. Whatever these men wanted, it was more than curiosity, more than casual interest in a stranger's child. Outside, the horses were moving, circling the building from the sound of it, cutting off escape routes. "Back door?" Magnus asked. "Leads to the alley. Nowhere to go from there but up or through." He nodded, unsurprised. Men like him thought in terms of exits, of sight lines and cover. Men like him had learned to expect trouble. The pounding stopped. In the sudden quiet, Violet could hear her own heartbeat, the whisper of wind through gaps in the walls, the distant sound of townspeople retreating behind locked doors. Then glass exploded. The front window shattered inward, spraying shards across the floor. A bottle followed, trailing fire and the acrid smell of kerosene. It struck the far wall, burst into flame that spread hungry fingers across the wooden planks. Violet raised the shotgun, finger finding the trigger. Through the broken window she could see movement, shadows shifting in the harsh sunlight. Now would be good, Magnus said. She squeezed both triggers. The shotgun bucked against her shoulder, sending pellets through the window frame where one of the riders had been standing. A horse screamed. A man cursed, voice high with pain and surprise. Magnus was moving before the echoes faded, crossing to the back of the saloon where another window gave view of the alley. His pistol was in his hand now, dark metal gleaming. "Two more coming around back," he called. Fire spread along the wall, eating at seasoned wood with greedy teeth. Smoke began to fill the room, acrid and choking. They had minutes before the building became a trap. Violet broke open the shotgun, fed fresh shells into the chambers. Her movements were automatic muscle memory from hours of practice in the desert behind town, preparation for a day she'd hoped would never come. "The baby," she said, "safe, hidden." Magnus's voice was grim. "They want her alive." Want. Present tense, which meant this wasn't random violence. This was targeted, specific. These men had come for the child. The back door exploded inward. Magnus fired twice, quick and precise. Someone screamed, someone fell, but more were coming. Violet could hear them outside, voices calling coordinates, planning their assault. Too many for two people to hold off, even with good positions and loaded guns. The fire was spreading faster now, climbing toward the ceiling. Soon the smoke would drive them out, force them into the open where numbers would tell. Magnus appeared beside her, face grim with calculation. "We need to move. Now." Violet looked around her saloon at the life she'd built from nothing. 16 years of careful work, of small victories and smaller defeats, all of it about to burn. "The stairs," she said. "We can reach the roof from the back room." Magnus nodded. Together they moved through the smoke, through the growing heat, toward whatever waited above. Behind them, fire consumed the place she'd called home. The fire drove them up through smoke and heat, through the narrow stairway that led to Violet's private rooms. Magnus carried the baby wrapped tight against his chest, her small face buried in the folds of his shirt. Violet followed, shotgun in one hand, the other pressed against the wall for balance. Below them, flames ate at 16 years of careful building. They reached the back room where Violet stored winter clothes and broken dreams. A ladder led through a trapdoor to the roof, rungs worn smooth by years of occasional repair work. Magnus went first, one-handed on the ladder, the baby secure in his other arm. His movements were fluid despite the awkward burden. Violet watched him disappear through the square of desert sky, then followed. The roof was hot beneath her palms, tar softened by the merciless sun. But it was also salvation. From here she could see the whole town spread below, could count the riders circling her burning saloon. 5 now. More than had started the attack. "They called for help," Magnus said. He'd positioned himself at the roof's edge, using the slight parapet for cover. The baby remained quiet in his arms, either sleeping or stunned into silence. Violet crawled beside him, careful to keep low. The shotgun was hot metal against her palm, but she held it steady. "What do they want?" Magnus's eyes found the distant mountains, purple shadows against the harsh sky. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old guilt. "Justice, or what passes for it out here." Below them, the riders had pulled back from the burning building. They sat their horses in a rough semicircle, waiting, watching, patient as vultures. "Justice for what?" Magnus shifted the baby to his other arm. His free hand touched the pistol at his hip, checking its position. The Pembertons weren't just traveling through when they died. They were running an underground station, moving people north to freedom. The words fell between them heavy as stones. Violet felt something cold settle in her stomach despite the heat radiating from the roof. "You helped them." "I guided them. Knew the safe routes, the water holes, the places raiders wouldn't think to look." Magnus's jaw tightened. Wasn't enough. Below, one of the riders called out, voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Come down, McAllister. Bring the girl. We'll make it quick." The girl, not the baby. The distinction mattered in ways that made Violet's throat close. "They think she saw something," she said. Magnus nodded. 6-month-old baby. But they're not taking chances. The fire had spread to the neighboring building now, flames leaping across the narrow alley that separated structures. Soon half the block would be burning. The whole town, maybe, if the wind picked up. All because she'd opened her door to a stranger. "I'm sorry," Magnus said. "Should have kept riding, should have known they'd track me here. Sorry." The word hung between them, inadequate and true. Violet studied his profile, the way grief had carved lines around his eyes, the careful way he held the child who'd already lost so much. "How long have you been running?" 6 months, since the massacre." His voice went flat, distant. "Been trying to find somewhere safe for her. Somewhere they wouldn't think to look. Somewhere." Violet thought of her carefully ordered life, her routines and walls and the protective distance she'd maintained from anything that might hurt her. All of it smoke now. "Tell me about Sarah." Magnus went very still. Below them, the riders were growing restless, their horses dancing in the heat. "Why?" "Because if we're going to die together, I want to know who we're dying for." The admission surprised them both. Violet felt the words settle in her chest, heavy and true. Somewhere in the space between storm and fire, between stranger and sanctuary, she'd made a choice that bound her to this man and his secrets. Magnus looked down at the baby in his arms. When he spoke, his voice was soft enough that Violet had to lean closer to hear. "Met her in Denver. She was buying supplies for the station, trying to look like just another settler's wife. But her hands were too soft, her clothes too fine." He paused. "Beautiful woman, kind. The type who sees suffering and can't walk away. The type who gets killed for caring," Violet thought but didn't say. "She hired me to guide a group of families north. Said it was routine, nothing special. Didn't tell me about the bounty on her head until we were 3 days out. 3 days. Time enough to care. Time enough to fall." "You loved her." It wasn't a question. Violet could hear it in the careful way he spoke Sarah's name, see it in the protective curve of his body around the child. "Loved them both." Magnus's hand moved to the baby's back, fingers spread wide against the small form. "Wasn't supposed to happen, was just a job, but Sarah, she had this way of making you believe things could be different. Better, better." The word tasted bitter in the smoke-filled air. "The attack came at dawn," Magnus continued. "Professional work. They knew exactly where to hit us when we'd be most vulnerable. Someone had sold us out. Someone always did, in Violet's experience. Trust was a luxury that got people killed. I got Sarah and the baby into a ravine, told them to stay hidden while I drew the raiders off. When I came back..." He stopped, jaw working. "When he came back, Sarah was dead." The unspoken words hung between them, heavy with implication. "The baby was still alive, hidden under her mother's body, crying so quiet I almost missed her." Violet felt something crack inside her chest. She looked down at the child, at the small face peaceful despite the chaos around them, and thought of other children who'd lost everything to men's violence. "What's her real name?" Magnus was quiet for so long Violet thought he wouldn't answer. Below them, smoke rose from her burning saloon, carrying the smell of her old life into the desert sky. "Grace," he said finally. "Sarah named her Grace." Grace. Not Hope, the name he'd given the night before. Another small deception, another wall between truth and survival. But looking at the child now, Violet thought Grace fit better. There was something ethereal about her, something that suggested light in dark places. "Grace Pemberton McAllister," she said, testing the weight of the full name. Magnus nodded. "If we live through this, that's who she'll be, my daughter, legal and binding." If they lived. The conditional hung between them, stark as the sun overhead. Below, the riders were moving again, closer now, impatient with waiting. Violet checked her shotgun, made sure both barrels were loaded. The metal was hot enough to burn, but she held it steady. "They'll rush us soon," Magnus said. "Can't wait much longer with the fire spreading." Violet nodded. She could see townspeople gathering at the far end of the street, too distant to help but close enough to witness whatever came next. She thought of Mrs. Henley, of the morning's gossip and suspicious questions, of 16 years spent building walls that were now burning around her. Magnus shifted beside her, readying for whatever came next. His free hand found hers on the roof's edge, fingers brushing her knuckles. The touch was brief. Accidental, maybe. But for the first time in 16 years, Violet didn't pull away. The riders charged when the roof began to buckle beneath them. Violet felt the supports give way, heard the crack of burning timber, and knew they had seconds before the building collapsed. Magnus moved first, sliding toward the ladder with Grace pressed against his chest. But the trapdoor was already wreathed in flame, the escape route cut off by the fire that had spread faster than either of them had calculated. "The next building," Violet called, pointing to the narrow gap between rooftops. "We can jump." Magnus looked at the distance, at the baby in his arms, at the drop to the street below, 6 feet across, 30 feet down to hard-packed dirt and the horses of men who wanted them dead. "You first," he said. Violet didn't argue. She backed up 3 steps, felt the roof sag beneath her weight, then ran. The gap opened beneath her, a slice of sky and smoke, and the upturned faces of riders who shouted when they saw her leap. She landed hard on the neighboring roof, rolled to absorb the impact, came up with the shotgun still in her hands. Behind her, Magnus was backing up for his own jump, the baby clutched against his chest with one arm. He ran, jumped. For a moment he hung suspended between buildings, between safety and the long fall that would end everything. Then his boots hit the roof beside her. They lay gasping in the heat, watching Violet's saloon collapse in a shower of sparks and burning wood. 16 years of her life reduced to ash and memory. "I need to tell you something," Magnus said. His voice was rough with smoke and something else, something that sounded dangerous in its honesty. Violet looked at him, at the way he held Grace with such fierce protection, at the guilt carved deep in the lines of his face. "The Pembertons," she said. "You were more than their guide." Magnus nodded slowly. His free hand found the roof's edge, gripped hard enough to whiten his knuckles. "I was their partner, had been for 2 years, running people north, taking money from rich abolitionists who wanted to buy their way into heaven." His jaw tightened. "Was good business, clean money, thought I was doing right." The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. "What changed?" "Sarah." The name came out soft, weighted with loss. "Met her in Denver, but not the way I said. She came to me, knew my reputation, asked me to guide her family on what she called their final run." Final. The word carried its own gravity. Magnus shifted Grace to his other arm, careful not to wake her. The Pembertons weren't just helping people escape. They were funding it. Hundreds of families, maybe thousands, all moving through stations they'd established across 3 territories. Below them, the riders had regrouped. Violet could see them pointing at the neighboring building, planning their next assault. "Someone wanted to shut them down," she said. "More than that, someone wanted to make an example. Show what happened to people who helped the wrong kind of folks find freedom." The wrong kind. Violet felt the familiar weight of those words, the way they divided the world into us and them, worthy and disposable. "You fell in love with her." Magnus went very still. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Didn't mean to. Was just supposed to get them safely north, collect my fee, move on to the next job. But Sarah, she saw something in me I didn't know was there." "What?" "Decency, maybe. The possibility that a man could be more than what he'd been." Magnus looked down at Grace, sleeping peacefully despite the chaos around them. "She made me want to be worthy of that faith." Faith. The word hung in the smoke-filled air between them. "The attack wasn't random," Violet said. "It wasn't a question. Professional work, military precision. They knew exactly where we'd be, what route we'd take, how many guns we carried." Magnus's hand moved to his pistol, checking its position. "Someone sold us out. Someone who knew the operation inside and out. Someone close enough to know details. Someone trusted. Who?" Magnus was quiet for a long moment, watching smoke rise from the ruins of Violet's life. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old betrayal. Don't know for certain, but the attack came right after we sent word ahead to the next station, right after we told them we were coming. The next station. Violet felt something cold settle in her stomach. Where was the next station? Here. Coyote Cliff. Magnus looked at her, his eyes dark with something that might have been apology or warning. Your saloon was listed as a safe house in Sarah's papers. The words hit her with the force of physical blows. Her saloon. Her carefully neutral establishment where she served drinks and minded her own business and never asked questions about the travelers who sometimes needed a room for the night. I never agreed to that. Didn't need to. Someone was using your place, your reputation for discretion. Probably been happening for months, maybe years, without you knowing. Without her knowing. Violet thought of the travelers who'd passed through, the quiet men and women who'd paid in cash and left before dawn, the ones who'd looked at her with something that might have been gratitude. She'd thought they were running from debt or bad marriages or the kind of trouble that followed people west. She'd never imagined they were running toward freedom. They were using me. They were protecting you. Plausible denial. If you didn't know, you couldn't be held responsible. But she was being held responsible now. Her saloon was burning. Men with guns wanted her dead. All because someone had decided her business was useful for their cause. The writers, she said, they think I'm part of it. Magnus nodded grimly. Think you helped hide the Pembertons. Think you know where their money went, who their contacts were. Think Grace might have heard something that could expose the whole network. A 6-month-old baby who could barely sit up, much less remember conversations. But men had killed for less, Violet knew. Fear made people stupid and guilty people feared everything. Below them, she could hear shouting. The riders were preparing for another assault, probably planning to burn this building too if necessary. There's something else, Magnus said. His voice had gone very quiet. Sarah didn't die in the attack. The words stopped Violet's heart. What? She lived long enough to talk, long enough to give them names, locations, everything they wanted to know about the network. Sarah Pemberton, the woman who'd seen goodness in a cynical world, who'd made Magnus want to be better than he was. She'd broken under torture and given up secrets that would get people killed. They have the information they wanted, Violet said. Why keep hunting you? Magnus looked down at Grace, at the small face that carried her mother's features and her father's stubbornness. Because she's not just a witness, she's proof. He paused, gathering himself for the final truth. Grace isn't just my daughter by choice, she's my daughter by blood, and Sarah wasn't just an abolitionist. The world tilted around Violet, rearranging itself into new and terrible patterns. She was a Pemberton, Magnus continued, heir to one of the biggest fortunes in the territories, and when she died, everything she owned passed to her child. Grace wasn't just a baby caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was an heiress, a symbol, a living reminder of everything the raiders had tried to destroy, and Violet had just bound herself to protecting her. The truth hit Violet harder than the heat rising from the burning buildings below. Grace Pemberton McAllister wasn't just a child caught in violence. She was a fortune with tiny hands and her mother's eyes, a legacy that men would kill to control or eliminate. Violet's chest tightened. The careful distance she'd maintained from Magnus, from the baby, from the whole situation crumbled under the weight of understanding. How much? Her voice came out steady despite the earthquake in her ribs. Enough to fund a war. Or stop one. Magnus shifted Grace in his arms, protective instincts taking over. The Pemberton estate owns mining rights, railroad shares, shipping companies. All of it legal now that slavery's done, but still worth more than most territories. Worth killing for. Worth burning down a town for. Below them, the riders had set fire to the building's base. Smoke began to rise through the floorboards beneath their feet. They'll never stop hunting her, Violet said. Magnus nodded grimly. Not while she represents everything they fought to destroy. Not while she's proof that people they consider less than human can inherit more wealth than they'll see in 10 lifetimes. The roof began to sag. Soon they'd have to move again, jump to another building, or climb down into the waiting guns of men who'd already decided their fate. Violet looked at Magnus, at the way he held Grace with absolute devotion, despite knowing she made him a target, at the guilt carved deep in his face for loving a woman whose death he couldn't prevent, at the lies he'd told to protect them both. "You should have kept running," she said, but there was no accusation in her voice, only weary understanding. "Thought about it. Every day for 6 months, thought about taking her somewhere far away. Mexico, maybe, or Canada. Somewhere they'd never think to look. Why didn't you?" Magnus was quiet for a long moment, watching flames eat through the building that had briefly sheltered them. "Because running isn't living, and Grace deserves better than spending her life looking over her shoulder." He paused. "So do you. So do you." The words settled in Violet's chest with unexpected weight. She thought of her 16 years in Coyote Cliff, building walls instead of relationships, keeping everyone at arm's length to avoid the pain of betrayal. She'd called it safety, but Magnus was right. It wasn't living. It was just a different kind of prison. The sound of boots on wood drifted up from below. The riders had entered the burning building, were climbing toward them through smoke and flame. "We need to move," Magnus said. But there was nowhere left to go. The next building was too far to jump. The street below crawled with men who wanted them dead. They were trapped between fire and fury with no way out. Violet checked her shotgun. 2 shells left. Magnus had maybe 4 rounds in his pistol. Not enough to fight their way clear, even if they'd been willing to kill for their freedom. "I'm sorry," Magnus said again. "Should never have brought this to your door. Sorry." The word had weight now, carried the full measure of what his presence had cost her. Her saloon, her life, her carefully constructed safety. But looking at him, at the baby sleeping peacefully despite the chaos, Violet realized she wasn't sorry. Not entirely. For 16 years she'd lived like a ghost, haunting her own existence. Touching no one, trusting nothing, building walls that kept out pain but also kept out everything else worth having. Magnus had brought danger, yes, but he'd also brought something else, purpose. "Don't apologize for giving me a reason to fight," she said. The words surprised them both. Magnus looked at her, something shifting in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or hope. The sound of boots grew louder, closer. Violet made a choice that would have terrified the woman she'd been yesterday. She reached out, let her fingers brush Magnus's hand where it rested against Grace's back. The contact sent electricity up her arm. Not fear this time, but something else. Something that felt dangerous in its warmth. Magnus went very still. 16 years since Violet had voluntarily touched a man, and her hand was trembling against his knuckles. But she didn't pull away. "Whatever happens," she said, "she's not dying alone, neither are you." The building shuddered beneath them. Flames licked through gaps in the roof, reaching for the sky with hungry fingers. Magnus turned his hand palm up, let her fingers settle against his. Calloused skin, scarred and weathered, but gentle in ways that Marcus's hands had never been. "Vi," he said, just her name, but weighted with things he couldn't say. The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. Then boots hammered on the stairs below, and the spell broke. They separated, turned toward the sound of approaching violence. Violet raised her shotgun. Magnus drew his pistol, careful not to jostle the sleeping child. "McAllister." The voice drifted up through smoke and flame. Young, cocky, certain of victory. "Come down, bring the girl, we'll make it quick for all of you. All of you." They knew about Violet now, had seen her jump between buildings. She was no longer an innocent bystander, but a participant in whatever crime they thought had been committed. "Counter offer," Magnus called back. "You ride out of town, forget you saw us, and maybe you live to see sunset." Laughter echoed up from below. Sharp, unpleasant sound that made Grace stir in her father's arms. "Big talk from a dead man." "Not dead yet," Magnus replied. But they would be soon, Violet knew. The math was simple and brutal. 5 men with guns against 2 people trying to protect a baby. Fire below, empty sky above, and nowhere to run. She thought of Mrs. Henley, of the morning gossip that seemed like a lifetime ago, of the careful life she'd built and the walls she'd maintained and the ways she'd sleepwalked through 16 years of existence. All of it burning now, all of it reduced to this moment, this choice, this stand she was making beside a man she barely knew. Magnus looked at her one more time. His eyes held apology and gratitude and something else. Something that looked startlingly close to love. "Thank you," he said. "For grace, for everything." Violet nodded. She understood what he wasn't saying. This was goodbye. This was the end of whatever might have grown between them. But it was also the beginning of something else. The first time in 16 years she'd chosen connection over safety, trust over fear. The first time she'd touched a man and felt warmth instead of terror. The boots were almost at the top of the stairs now. Any moment, armed men would emerge through the smoke, and the fighting would begin in earnest. Violet raised her shotgun, finger finding the trigger. Beside her, Magnus shifted Grace to his left arm, kept his pistol ready in his right. They waited together in the growing heat, bound by shared danger and the impossible hope that love might be stronger than the forces arrayed against them. The roof began to collapse. The town came to them instead of the riders. Violet heard them first, the sound of running feet on packed earth, voices calling through smoke and chaos. Not the voices of attackers but of neighbors. People she'd served drinks to, sold rooms to, maintained careful distance from for 16 years. They poured into the street below carrying buckets and shovels, organized in the way frontier communities learned to be when survival depended on everyone working together. Mrs. Henley directed traffic with sharp gestures. Old Pete from the livery stable led a bucket brigade from the well. Even the preacher was there, sleeves rolled up, face grim with purpose. The riders found themselves surrounded. Magnus watched from the collapsing roof, Grace still secure in his arms. His expression was unreadable, caught between hope and disbelief. "They came," he said. Simple words weighted with wonder. Below, the thin rider who'd led the attack was shouting orders, trying to regroup his men. But the townspeople moved with quiet efficiency, surrounding the raiders without seeming to. Hands stayed near weapons without drawing them. Eyes stayed watchful without seeming threatening. The kind of coordinated response that spoke of practice, of other times when Coyote Cliff had closed ranks against outside threats. "Vi," Mrs. Henley's voice cut through the smoke. "You up there?" Violet moved to the roof's edge, careful to stay low. The heat was becoming unbearable, the building beneath them crumbling by degrees. "Here," she called back. "Buildings coming down, you need to move." The problem was where? The neighboring structures were either too far to reach or already burning. The street below was still controlled by armed men, even if those men were now outnumbered. Magnus studied the situation, tactical mind working. "The church," he said, pointing to the white building that stood apart from the commercial district. "Roof stone, won't burn." The church was 30 yards away across open ground. 30 yards of exposure to rifles and pistols and the particular hatred of men who'd ridden here to kill. But the alternative was burning alive. "Can you make that jump with her?" Violet asked. Magnus looked at Grace, sleeping peacefully despite the chaos, at the distance between buildings, at the drop that would kill them all if he miscalculated. "Have to." The building shuddered again. Part of the roof collapsed inward, sending sparks and burning debris cascading into the street. They had minutes, maybe less. "Go," Violet said. "I'll cover you." Magnus hesitated. Leaving her meant splitting their defensive capability, reducing their already slim chances. But staying meant all three of them dying when the building fell. "Don't be noble," Violet added. "She needs you alive more than I need help dying." The words came out harder than she'd intended, but they carried truth. Grace was the future, the innocent life that mattered more than the mistakes and regrets of adults. Magnus nodded once. Then he was moving, backing up for his run at impossible distance. Below, the thin rider had spotted the movement. His rifle came up, seeking targets through the smoke. Violet put both barrels of her shotgun into the area around his horse. The animal screamed, reared, threw its rider into the dust. Other horses scattered, disrupting whatever formation the raiders had managed to maintain. Magnus ran, jumped, hung suspended over the gap with Grace pressed against his chest. A rifle cracked. The bullet took splinters from the church roof where Magnus landed hard, rolled to absorb impact, came up running toward the stone bell tower. He'd made it, both of them, alive and moving toward better cover. Violet felt something ease in her chest, followed immediately by the realization that her part in their story was ending. The building beneath her was collapsing, the raiders below were regrouping, and she had no way to follow Magnus across the impossible gap. She'd bought them time. Maybe that was enough. The thin rider had found a new horse, was shouting orders to his scattered men. But the townspeople were closing in now, no longer content to just maintain perimeter. She could see weapons in their hands, determination in their faces. "You picked the wrong town," old Pete called out, his voice carrying clearly in the smoky air. The rider's response was lost in the sound of the building finally giving way beneath Violet's feet. She fell through flame and smoke, through the wreckage of her old life, into darkness that lasted exactly long enough for her to think this was how it ended. Then strong hands caught her, pulled her clear of the burning debris. She found herself on solid ground, looking up into faces she recognized but had never really seen before. Mrs. Henley, the preacher, Tom from the general store, all of them looking down at her with something that might have been concern. "Easy there, Vi," Mrs. Henley said. "You're all right, we got you. We got you." The words settled in Violet's chest with unexpected warmth. For 16 years she'd lived in this town, served these people, maintained careful boundaries that kept everyone at safe distance. But when the moment came when choice meant standing with strangers against known quantities, they'd chosen her. "The baby," she said, struggling to sit up. "Magnus." "Safe," the preacher confirmed. "Saw them reach the church. Building stone throughout, won't burn." Around them, the confrontation was resolving with the brutal efficiency of frontier justice. The riders found themselves disarmed, surrounded, facing the united front of a community that had decided their presence was unwelcome. The thin rider tried one last bluff, hand moving toward his gun. Tom's rifle spoke first. The bullet kicked dust near the rider's feet, close enough to make the point without drawing blood. "Don't," Tom said mildly. "We're reasonable people, but our patience has limits." The rider's hand moved away from his weapon. Around him, his men were making similar calculations, weighing pride against survival and finding pride wanting. "This isn't over," the thin rider called, but his voice lacked conviction. "People know about this place, about what you're hiding." "Let them come," Mrs. Henley replied. "We'll be ready." The words carried the weight of collective decision. Whatever Coyote Cliff had been before this day, it was something different now. A place that had chosen sides, made declarations, drawn lines that couldn't be uncrossed. The riders mounted their horses and left without ceremony, disappearing into the desert heat that had brought them. Behind them, the town burned in spots but stood in others, wounded but whole. Violet found herself looking toward the church where Magnus waited with Grace. 30 yards that might as well have been 30 miles, given the gap between her old life and whatever came next. Mrs. Henley followed her gaze, understanding passing between them without words. "Go on," the older woman said. "Some things can't wait for perfect timing." Violet stood on unsteady legs, brushed dust and debris from her clothes. Around her, the townspeople were already organizing cleanup efforts, forming bucket brigades to save what could be saved. But all of that could wait. The baby was safe, Magnus was alive, and for the first time in 16 years, Violet had somewhere important to be. She walked toward the church through smoke and settling dust, toward the man who'd given her a reason to fight, and the child who represented hope in a world too fond of endings. Behind her, Coyote Cliff began the long work of rebuilding. Ahead, the church doors stood open, welcoming her toward whatever came next. Sheriff Dalton arrived with the sunset, riding into Coyote Cliff like salvation in a badge and dusty coat. Violet watched him from the church steps where she sat with Magnus and Grace, all three of them refugees from the day's violence. The townspeople gathered around Dalton's horse, voices overlapping as they told their version of events. Raiders, they said, troublemakers from outside, men who'd attacked innocent folks and burned honest businesses. Dalton listened with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to sorting truth from frontier exaggeration. His eyes swept the damaged buildings, the smoke still rising from scattered ruins, the faces of people who'd chosen sides in a conflict they barely understood. "Where are they now?" he asked. "Gone," Mrs. Henley replied. "Ran off when decent folks stood up to them." Gone. The word carried finality, suggesting closed books and settled accounts, but Violet could see something in Dalton's expression that suggested the story wasn't over. He dismounted, handed his reins to old Pete, then walked toward the church with the deliberate pace of a man who'd already made decisions. His boots were quiet on the packed earth, but his presence filled the space between buildings. "McAllister," he called when he was still 20 paces away. "Need to have a word." Magnus stood slowly, Grace secure in his arms. The baby was awake now, dark eyes taking in the world with the serious attention of someone too young to understand danger but old enough to sense tension. "Sheriff," Magnus replied. Neutral tone, careful distance. Dalton stopped at the base of the church steps. Up close, Violet could see the lines around his eyes, the way his hand rested casually near his gun. A careful man in a careful position. "Heard there was trouble today. Heard your name mentioned in connection with it." "Heard right." Magnus shifted Grace to his other arm. "Men came looking for us. Burned down Vi's place trying to get what they wanted." "Which was?" Magnus looked down at the child in his arms, then back at Dalton. "The baby. They seemed to think she knew something worth killing for." Dalton's eyes moved to Grace, taking in the expensive locket, the fine blanket, the careful way Magnus held her. Professional assessment, the kind that missed nothing. "Baby looks familiar," Dalton said finally. The words fell between them heavy as stones. Violet felt something cold settle in her stomach as understanding began to take shape. "Does she now?" Magnus kept his voice level, but Violet could see tension gathering in his shoulders. "Reminds me of some sketches I saw a few months back. Territorial Marshal's office put out descriptions after the Pemberton massacre. Whole family killed, they said, but the baby was never found." Never found. Dalton's eyes stayed on Grace as he spoke, reading features that were becoming more familiar by the moment. "Terrible thing, that massacre," he continued. "Rich family, doing good work, helping folks who needed it. Raiders killed them all for the crime of showing kindness to the wrong people." The wrong people. Violet heard the careful emphasis, understood the layers of meaning beneath Dalton's words. "Must have been hard," Magnus said, "losing people who were trying to help. Harder still when the killers got away clean, left no witnesses, no evidence, nothing to follow." Dalton paused, let his words settle. "Course, now it seems like maybe there was a witness after all." A witness. Grace stirred in Magnus's arms, small hands reaching for nothing, dark eyes reflecting light from the setting sun. "Baby that young," Magnus said carefully, "wouldn't remember much. Might not remember, but she'd still be evidence, living proof of what happened that day. Some folks might find that inconvenient. Some folks." The phrase hung in the air between them, weighted with implication. Violet found herself standing, though she hadn't consciously decided to move. Something in Dalton's tone, in the careful way he circled around direct accusation, made her skin crawl. "Sheriff," she said, "if you've got something to say, maybe you should say it plain." Dalton turned his attention to her, eyes taking in her burned dress, her smoke-stained face, the way she positioned herself beside Magnus. "Miss Johnson, heard you took quite a risk today harboring strangers." Harboring. The word carried legal weight, suggested crimes and consequences. "Helped neighbors," she corrected. "Nothing more complicated than that." "Neighbors." Dalton smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Interesting way to put it. Man shows up one day with a baby that looks mighty familiar. Next day raiders are burning your place down." Some might call that more than coincidence. More than coincidence. Violet felt the trap closing around them, understood that Dalton wasn't here to help. Some might call it bad luck, she replied. Might? Dalton's hand moved closer to his gun, the gesture casual but unmistakable. Course, I've got orders to bring in anyone connected to the Pemberton situation. For their own protection, you understand. Protection. The word tasted like ash in Violet's mouth. Magnus had gone very still beside her, the kind of stillness that preceded violence. Grace seemed to sense the tension, began to fuss in his arms. Orders from who? Magnus asked. Territorial marshal, federal authorities, people who want to make sure justice gets done. Dalton's smile widened. Important folks have taken an interest in this case. Want to make sure all loose ends get tied up proper. Loose ends. Grace was a loose end. Magnus was a loose end. Anyone who'd helped them was a loose end that needed tying. What kind of justice? Violet asked, though she suspected she already knew. The kind that makes examples, shows what happens to people who interfere with legitimate business interests. Dalton's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and final beneath. The kind that makes sure certain types of folks know their place. Their place. The words carried the weight of old hatreds, deep prejudices that ran through the territory's blood. Violet understood now. The Pemberton massacre hadn't been random violence. It had been a message, a warning to anyone who might help the wrong people find freedom. And Dalton wasn't here to investigate. He was here to finish what the raiders had started. You're one of them, she said, not a question. Dalton's hand found his gun, but he didn't draw, not yet. I'm a duly appointed officer of the law, Miss Johnson, sworn to uphold order and protect decent folks from troublemakers. Decent folks. The phrase excluded by definition anyone who didn't fit Dalton's narrow vision of acceptable. The raiders, Magnus said, understanding dawning in his voice. You sent them. I facilitated communication between interested parties, made sure information reached people who could act on it. Dalton's tone was matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather. Town needed to understand the consequences of harboring fugitives. Fugitives. Grace made a small sound, neither quite crying nor laughing. The innocent noise seemed to galvanize Dalton. Now, he said, hand tightening on his gun, I'm going to need you to hand over the child. And then we're all going to take a ride. Answer some questions. Clear up any misunderstandings. Questions that would never be answered. Misunderstandings that would end in shallow graves. Violet felt something crystallize inside her chest. For 16 years she'd lived carefully, avoiding confrontation, keeping her head down, playing it safe. But safety was an illusion. Safety was what powerful men offered in exchange for silence about their crimes. She was done being safe. No, she said. The word hung in the desert air, simple and final. Dalton's eyes narrowed. Excuse me. I said no. Violet moved closer to Magnus, close enough that their shoulders touched. You want the baby, you'll have to go through us. Us. The word bound them together against whatever came next. Dalton drew his gun. The gun never cleared Dalton's holster. Mrs. Henley's voice cut through the tension sharp as broken glass. I wouldn't, Sheriff. Dalton froze, hand half drawn. Behind him, the townspeople had formed a semicircle, quiet as shadows but unmistakably present. Old Pete held his rifle loose but ready. Tom from the general store had positioned himself to cut off retreat. Even the preacher stood with his congregation, Bible in one hand, something harder in his expression. This is official business, Dalton said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Is it now? Mrs. Henley stepped closer, her presence filling the space between threat and resolution. Funny how official business always seems to involve pointing guns at babies. Babies. Grace stirred in Magnus's arms, small face scrunched against the setting sun. The sight of her seemed to galvanize the crowd, reminded them what they were protecting. The child is evidence in a federal case, Dalton tried again. I have authority here. You have a badge, the preacher corrected. Authority comes from the people who trust you to do right by them. Trust. The word hung in the desert air, weighted with implications. Violet could see Dalton measuring odds, counting guns, calculating whether his position was strong enough to enforce his will. It wasn't. Magnus shifted Grace to his left arm, keeping his right hand free. But he didn't draw his weapon. Didn't need to. The town had already made its choice. "You sent those raiders," old Pete said. "Not a question. Burned Vi's place. Could have killed folks." "I facilitated necessary law enforcement activities," Dalton replied, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cooling air. Necessary. The word tasted bitter in the growing twilight. Necessary for who? Mrs. Henley pressed. Not for Grace, not for Magnus, not for any of us trying to live decent lives. Decent lives. Violet thought of the morning's gossip, the suspicious glances, the careful questions about strangers. How quickly suspicion had transformed into protection when the stakes became clear. "The child is valuable," Dalton said, playing his last card. "Worth more money than this whole town will see in 10 years. People who control that money want it handled properly. Properly. Code for quietly, permanently, in ways that wouldn't raise inconvenient questions. Money's not everything, Sheriff," Tom said. "Some things matter more. Some things." Grace chose that moment to smile, tiny face lighting up as she looked around at the circle of protectors. The expression was innocent, trusting, completely unaware of the forces aligned against her. Violet felt something break open in her chest. This child represented everything the raiders wanted to destroy. Mixed blood in a world that demanded purity. Inherited wealth in hands they considered unworthy. Living proof that their vision of natural order was a lie. But she also represented something else. Hope that the world could be different. Better. That people could choose kindness over fear, protection over profit. "Stand down, Sheriff," Mrs. Henley said. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize right from wrong. "Whatever you're being paid, it's not worth this." Dalton's hand trembled on his gun. He was outnumbered, outflanked, facing a community that had decided his authority didn't extend to harming children. But men like Dalton didn't surrender easily. "You're making a mistake," he said. "All of you. When word gets out about what happened here, they'll send more men, better armed, less patient. The faceless power behind the badge, the money behind the violence. Let them come," Magnus said quietly. "Won't be the first time this town's faced down bullies. Won't be the first." Violet looked around at her neighbors, seeing them clearly for maybe the first time. These weren't just shopkeepers and farmers. They were survivors. People who traveled west to escape something, who'd built lives from nothing, who understood that some things were worth fighting for. "Besides," Magnus continued, "you're assuming anyone will know you were here." The implications settled over the group with the weight of desert silence. Dalton was alone, outnumbered, far from backup. If he disappeared into the vast emptiness beyond Coyote Cliff, it might be months before anyone came looking. Years, maybe. "You wouldn't," Dalton said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Wouldn't what?" old Pete asked mildly. "Help a corrupt sheriff find his way out of our town. Encourage him to rethink his career choices. Make sure he understands the consequences of threatening children." Threatening children. The phrase hung in the air, damning in its simplicity. Dalton looked around the circle of faces, searching for weakness, for someone who might break ranks. He found only resolve hardened by shared purpose. "This isn't over," he said finally. "People know I came here. If I don't report back—" "You will report back," Mrs. Henley interrupted. "You'll tell your bosses that the baby died in the fire, that McAllister was killed by raiders, that there's nothing left to recover. Nothing left. The lie that would buy them time, maybe even safety. And if I refuse, then you won't be reporting anything to anyone," Tom said with quiet finality. The choice was simple, brutal, necessary. Dalton could lie and live, or refuse and face the consequences of threatening what the town had chosen to protect. Violet watched him weigh options, calculate odds. She could see the moment he realized his authority had limits, that badges and laws meant nothing when communities decided to protect their own. "The money," he tried one last time. "We'll stay with the child," Magnus said. "Where it belongs. Where it belongs." Grace gurgled softly, reaching for something only she could see. The sound broke whatever resolve Dalton had left. He holstered his gun with careful deliberation, raised his hands to show empty palms. "I came here looking for fugitives," he said slowly. "Found nothing but the aftermath of a raider attack. No survivors, no evidence, nothing to report. Nothing to report." The words that would close the case, end the hunting, give Grace a chance to grow up in peace. "That's the truth of it," Mrs. Henley agreed. "Nothing here but a town that survived another bad day. Survived." Violet looked at Magnus, at the way he held Grace with such fierce protection, at the townspeople who'd chosen to stand between innocence and the forces that would destroy it. They'd done more than survive. They decided what kind of people they wanted to be. Dalton backed toward his horse, movements careful and controlled. When he reached the animal, he mounted without taking his eyes off the group. "This town's made enemies today," he said. "We've had enemies before," the preacher replied. "Survived them too." Dalton rode out as the sun touched the horizon, disappearing into the desert that had swallowed so many others. Violet watched until he was just a speck against the vast sky, then turned back to the people who'd become something more than neighbors. They'd become family. Magnus looked down at Grace, then at Violet, then at the community that had claimed them both. "Thank you," he said simply. Mrs. Henley waved away his gratitude. "Just did what needed doing." What needed doing? In the gathering darkness, Violet felt something she hadn't experienced in 16 years. She felt like she belonged. Iron Jake Morrison arrived with the new moon, when darkness lay thick across Coyote Cliff and honest people slept behind locked doors. Violet woke to the sound of horses moving careful and quiet through the street, too many hooves for casual travel. She dressed in silence, fingers finding familiar routines while her mind calculated odds. 3 weeks since Dalton's visit. 3 weeks of careful normalcy, of pretending Grace had never existed, of building the lie that would keep them all alive. But lies had limits, and Morrison had come to test them. Magnus was already awake when she reached the main room of the rebuilt saloon. He sat by the window with Grace sleeping in his lap, both of them silhouettes against the star-filled sky. His rifle leaned against his chair, loaded and ready. "How many?" Violet asked. "Dozen, maybe more. Professional work. They've got the town surrounded." Surrounded. Violet thought of Mrs. Henley sleeping above her shop, of old Pete in his rooms behind the livery, of all the people who'd chosen to protect Grace and now face consequences for that choice. "They know," she said. Magnus nodded. "Dalton talked or someone did, doesn't matter now." Outside, a voice called through the darkness. Cultured accent, East Coast education refined by Western violence. "McAllister, I know you're in there. Time we had a conversation." Morrison. The name carried weight in 3 territories, associated with burned settlements and unmarked graves. The kind of man who turned violence into profit and called it business. "What does he want?" Violet asked, though she suspected she knew. "Same thing everyone wants, the child, the money, an end to complications." Grace stirred in Magnus's arms, making small sounds in her sleep. 9 months old now, beginning to sit up on her own, to recognize faces and respond to voices. Old enough to form attachments. Old enough to break hearts when she was taken. "We could run," Violet said. "Back way into the desert, they might not expect it. With a baby, in this heat," Magnus shook his head. "We'd be dead by noon, assuming they didn't track us down first. Dead by noon." The desert was unforgiving to those who challenged it unprepared. Grace would suffer most, her small body unable to handle the extremes that killed grown men. "Besides," Magnus added, "where would we go? Morrison's got connections from here to California. Money enough to buy cooperation from anyone who might help us." Money. The Pemberton fortune that made Grace valuable also made her a target no distance could diminish. The voice called again, closer now. "I'm a reasonable man, McAllister. All I want is what belongs to my employers. No need for anyone else to get hurt. Anyone else." The phrase carried dark implications, suggested that some people were already beyond saving. Violet moved to the other window, peered through gaps in the curtains. She could see shapes moving in the street, riders positioned to control all approaches. Morrison had planned this assault with military precision. "The town," she said. "They'll kill anyone who gets in their way," Magnus confirmed. "Morrison doesn't leave witnesses. Witnesses. Everyone who'd stood with them against Dalton, who'd chosen protection over profit, who decided some things mattered more than personal safety. All of them marked for death because they'd shown kindness to strangers." Grace woke with a soft cry, dark eyes opening to find Magnus's face above her. She smiled, the innocent expression that had melted Violet's carefully constructed walls, the smile that was about to get them all killed. "There has to be something," Violet said. Magnus looked down at the child in his arms, at the small life that had already cost so much. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of impossible decisions. "There is. But you won't like it." The tone made Violet's stomach clench. She turned from the window, studied Magnus's profile in the starlight, saw resolution settling in the lines of his face. "What are you thinking?" "I take Grace. Walk out there. Give Morrison what he wants." Give Morrison what he wants. Grace would disappear into the network of violence and profit that had killed her mother. The Pemberton fortune would pass to men who'd use it to fund more hatred, more division, more destruction. "That's not a solution," Violet said. "That's surrender. It's the only way to keep the town safe. Morrison gets what he came for. He has no reason to hurt anyone else. Anyone else. But he'd hurt Grace. Kill her most likely once her legal value was extracted. A child couldn't inherit if she didn't exist." "No," Violet said. Magnus looked at her, something shifting in his expression. I said no." She moved away from the window, closer to the man and child who'd become her reason for existing. "We don't trade children for peace. Not ever. Not ever." The words carried the weight of absolute conviction. Outside, Morrison was growing impatient. "5 minutes, McAllister. Then we come in and take what we want anyway." 5 minutes. Enough time for goodbyes, for final words, for the kind of desperate plans that usually ended badly. Violet looked around the rebuilt saloon, at the life she'd constructed from the ashes of the old. New wood, fresh paint, careful arrangements that spoke of hope rather than mere survival. All of it about to burn again. But this time she wouldn't run, wouldn't hide behind walls and distance and the careful choreography of never caring too much about anything. This time she'd fight. "The back room," she said suddenly. "The root cellar." Magnus frowned. "What about it?" "Connects to the old mine shaft, the one that runs under half the town." Violet's mind raced, calculating distances and possibilities. "Tunnel exits near the church, the livery, Mrs. Henley's shop." Near the church. Magnus's expression shifted as understanding dawned. "The whole town," he said. "The whole town. Connected underground, hidden from view. We get Grace to safety, then bring the fight to Morrison on our terms." Our terms. The phrase bound them together in shared purpose, made allies of people who'd found each other in the storm. Outside, Morrison called time. Heavy footsteps approached the saloon's front door. Magnus stood, Grace secure in his arms. "If this goes wrong—" "It won't," Violet interrupted. "Can't afford for it to go wrong. Can't afford." The cost of failure was measured in lives, in the future of a child who represented everything good people could build together. The front door exploded inward. Violet was already moving, leading Magnus toward the back room where salvation waited in the form of a hole in the ground. Behind them, armed men poured through the ruined doorway, voices sharp with command and threat. But they were too late. Their targets had vanished into the earth, into the network of tunnels that would carry them toward whatever came next. Morrison's voice echoed through the empty saloon, frustrated and dangerous. "Find them. Find them." But Coyote Cliff had secrets, and some secrets were worth dying to protect. The hunt was about to become something Morrison hadn't planned for, something that would test whether money and violence were stronger than community and love. In the tunnels beneath the town, Grace slept peacefully in her father's arms, while the woman who'd claimed them both led them toward their final stand. The tunnels beneath Coyote Cliff had been carved by miners who'd dreamed of silver and found only stone. Now they served a different purpose, carrying 3 fugitives through darkness toward whatever waited above. Violet led the way, memory guiding her through passages she'd explored as children sometimes did, back when the town was younger and secrets were fewer. Magnus followed with Grace pressed against his chest, the baby sleeping peacefully despite the chaos they'd left behind. Behind them, Morrison's men searched empty rooms and cursed their luck. The tunnel emerged in Mrs. Henley's cellar, hidden behind barrels of flour and preserved fruit. Violet pushed through the concealed entrance, breathing air that smelled of cinnamon and old wood instead of earth and desperation. Mrs. Henley waited for them in her kitchen, fully dressed despite the hour. She'd heard the commotion, understood what it meant, prepared for whatever came next. "They're all over the street," she said without preamble. Morrison brought an army, an army. Through the kitchen window, Violet could see shapes moving in the darkness. Too many men with too many guns, all focused on extracting value from a child's life. "The others?" Magnus asked. "Waiting." Mrs. Henley's voice carried grim satisfaction. "Tom's got the general store locked down tight. Pete's covering the livery. Preachers in the church with anyone who wanted sanctuary. Sanctuary. But churches offered protection only to those who believed in the power of sacred ground. Morrison struck Violet as a man who respected nothing but force. Grace stirred in Magnus's arms, dark eyes opening to take in unfamiliar surroundings. She didn't cry, just watched the adults with the serious attention of someone learning to read faces for danger. "What's the plan?" Mrs. Henley asked. "The plan." Violet looked around the kitchen, at the tools of normal life interrupted by violence. Rolling pins and cast iron pans, preserving jars and sharp knives. Everything needed for survival, nothing designed for war. But war had come anyway. "We end this," she said. "Tonight, permanently, permanently." The word carried weight that made Mrs. Henley nod slowly. "Morrison's got to go," Magnus agreed. "Long as he's alive, Grace will never be safe. None of us will. None of us." The community that had chosen sides, made enemies, decided some things were worth dying for. Outside, voices called back and forth as Morrison's men coordinated their search. Professional communications, military efficiency applied to the problem of hunting children. "How?" Mrs. Henley asked. Violet moved to the window, studied the patterns of movement in the street. Morrison had positioned his men to control all obvious routes, but he was thinking of the town as a collection of separate buildings rather than a connected whole. That would be his mistake. "The mine shafts," she said. "They connect everything. We can move without being seen, coordinate attacks, disappear when we need to. Disappear. The advantage of fighting on familiar ground, of knowing secrets that strangers couldn't guess." "What about Grace?" Magnus asked. "What about Grace? The child who'd started this, who represented everything they were fighting to protect. Too young to understand, but too important to abandon." "She stays with me," Mrs. Henley said firmly. "Hidden, safe, while you two do what needs doing." "What needs doing?" "Violence, probably. The kind of frontier justice that left bodies cooling in desert sand and questions unanswered for decades." Magnus looked down at Grace, at the small face that had already seen too much loss. His hand moved to stroke her cheek, and she grabbed his finger with the fierce grip of someone who'd learned early that letting go meant losing everything. "I don't like leaving her," he said. "Neither do I." Violet surprised herself with the admission. Somewhere between storm and fire, between danger and defiance, the child had become theirs. Not by blood or law, but by choice, by the bonds forged in shared protection. "But Morrison won't stop until we stop him," she continued. "And we can't do that while we're running. They'd tried that, tried staying ahead of the violence that followed Grace wherever she went. But there was no outrunning hatred that had money behind it, no hiding from men who turned murder into profit. The time for running was over. Mrs. Henley took Grace from Magnus's arms, the transfer accomplished with the practiced ease of women who understood children's needs. The baby settled against her comfortably, recognizing safety in the older woman's steady presence. "You bring them back," Mrs. Henley said. "Both of you. This little one's going to need parents when this is over." Parents. The word settled in Violet's chest with surprising warmth. She'd given up dreams of family 16 years ago, buried them with Marcus's betrayal and her own broken trust. But maybe dreams could be resurrected, rebuilt from better materials. Magnus checked his rifle, made sure the action was smooth. Violet found the shotgun Mrs. Henley kept for protection, loaded both barrels with careful precision. Outside, Morrison's voice cut through the night air. "I know you're out there, McAllister. This can be easy or hard. Your choice." Easy or hard. But some choices transcended simple categories, reached into questions of right and wrong that couldn't be compromised. "Hard it is," Magnus murmured. They left through Mrs. Henley's back door, slipping into shadows that knew their names. The tunnel entrance behind the general store welcomed them back into the earth, into the network of passages that would carry them toward Morrison and whatever waited there. Above them, Grace slept in Mrs. Henley's arms while the town held its breath. Below, two people who'd found each other in the storm prepared to end the violence that had followed them home. The tunnels carried them toward Main Street, toward the saloon where Morrison waited with his men and his guns, and his absolute certainty that money could buy any outcome he desired. They emerged behind the church, in shadows deep enough to hide their approach. From here they could see the saloon, could count the men positioned around it, could plan the attack that would determine whether Grace grew up free or died before her first birthday. Magnus looked at Violet, at the woman who'd opened her door to strangers and found herself fighting for everything that mattered. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready." Violet thought of 16 years spent hiding, of walls built to keep out pain but also love, of the careful distance she'd maintained from anything that might hurt her. All of it ending here, in the street where she'd chosen to make her stand. "Ready," she said. They moved through darkness toward the light spilling from the saloon's windows, toward Morrison and his men, toward the confrontation that would decide whether love was stronger than the forces arrayed against it. Behind them, Grace slept peacefully in the arms of a woman who'd helped raise a community, who understood that some things were worth fighting for. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles but bearing witness to the choices people made when everything they cared about hung in the balance. The final battle for Grace Pemberton McAllister was about to begin, and that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel, and if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.